where you are, and welcome to the third webinar presented by the Global Foundation for the Performing Arts in association with the Resiliart movement of UNESCO. Today's topic that you're joining us for is classical music's new world. And we're continuing our Resiliart movement webinar series by diving into the classical music world space. Our previous two webinars have focused on the world of ballet, and I'm delighted that we turn our attention to the classical music sector, which has also been severely impacted by the current situation with COVID-19. My name is Benjamin Woodruff. I'm the president of the Global Foundation for the Performing Arts, and we exist to facilitate, to connect, to advocate, and to support performing artists in the disciplines of dance and classical music. Today's webinar is a free public webinar curated by the Global Foundation for the Performing Arts in partnership with the Secretariat for the UNESCO Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultural Expressions. We are a signatory to this convention, and I salute the work that UNESCO is doing in this time of crisis to highlight the impact on the cultural sector. The Global Foundation for the Performing Arts is extremely concerned by the devastating impact of the current crisis on the livelihoods of cultural professionals and the cultural fabric of our societies. During the lockdown period, we have relied heavily on culture, including dance and ballet performances, for emotional support, while the very creators of these artistic expressions have been left with little to no economic or social assistance. This is why we're part of the Resiliart Global Movement for Arts Professionals, supported by UNESCO. COVID-19 has impacted the classical music sector greatly. Artists, conservatoires, concert venues, festivals, orchestras have all altered their operations and schedules significantly. However, this time of reassessment has inspired new ways of keeping our art form alive. Greater international connection and resource sharing are expanding, and alternative futures are being developed. I'm honored and delighted that we have a broad and well-qualified panel of experts and leaders in the classical music scene across the globe. And it's my pleasure to give an overview quickly now of who we'll be talking with and where the people that we'll be hearing from, many of whom are musicians themselves and are very aware of the impact of this COVID-19 situation on their colleagues. We have, in alphabetical order, Professor Bruce Brubaker from the United States, chair of the piano department and a concert pianist at the New England Conservatory. We are joined by Oliver Condy, editor-in-chief of BBC Music Magazine in England, the world's largest classical music selling magazine. We're joined by Mary Finsterer, composer and educator at the University of Tasmania. We're joined by Till Jankukovic, founder and CEO of Idagio, the streaming platform for classical music. We also have Professor Bernard Lansky, pianist and director of the Yong Siu To Conservatory at the National University of Singapore. Mr. Jasper Parrott, founder and executive chairman of Harris & Parrott, is with us today. Mr. Matthias Tarnopolowski, President and Chief Executive Officer of Philadelphia Orchestra, joins us early in the morning. We're also joined by Professor Alexei Vasilyev, President and Rector of the St. Petersburg State Conservatory. And last but not least, Professor Lihua Wang, composer and President of the China Conservatory of Music and Chairman of the Global Music Education League. Thank you all for being with us at this time. Before we get started, I would like to give you, the audience, a sense of how this will work. and we invite and welcome your input towards this panel and towards this topic in general. It is possible for you in the Zoom audience to send questions to William and myself as hosts to direct either to specific panelists or for the topic in general. We encourage you to do so. We are also happy that this Zoom broadcast is being fed live to our Facebook page, which is Facebook, the GFPA, and it's also being streamed live through Zoom China. So we thank our supporters and our technical sponsors for making this possible. So now the topic. We have a number of panelists, we have a number of leaders and thinking thought provokers, and I think it's time to get started. We're going to move around the screen, and I'm delighted to kickstart the conversation with a fellow Australian and a colleague and somewhat of a mentor of mine, actually, Professor Bernard Lansky from the Yong Siew To Conservatory of Music. Bernard, feel free, take the floor, share your thoughts on how this year is impacting and what you think may be coming in our sector.
I think it's actually a really complicated situation. I mean, one could almost see it as sort of manic depressive in some ways, because the strengths and highs, I think, have been incredibly creative and really fascinating. The challenges have been really bleak at times. I see a contrast between the experience that many of our alumni, for example, are facing, where many in international contexts, so they don't hold the right passport of the country in which they're working, so they may not be eligible for support. They're working in gig economy contexts where they've had to move quickly online. They're often minorities in environments where around them will be all sorts of statements being made about what is considered the lockdown norm, and they're having to fit as outsiders in relation to that. And yet they've been incredibly resilient in doing some really exciting things. They form, it seems to me, a large part of the classical music environment and industry. They're not attached to institutions, and obviously I'm recognizing the challenges that institutions have faced, but there are also many, many individuals who are finding their own way and having to deal with this in a much more lonely and often alien environment. The students, on the other hand, I think it's been quite an interesting journey. Here in Singapore, the country recognized COVID very quickly, and we spent 2/3 of our semester sort of half locked down, which ironically gave the students more platforms because our big name people were not able to get into the country. So we lost Gabor Takash, we lost Masaki Suzuki, we lost other various people who were meant to visit because we couldn't get them in, plus we couldn't have an audience in front of them either. So the students ended up more at the center point. And I think there's been a lot of things that have happened where the traditional power relations have begun to be affected in all sorts of interesting ways. Some of our most exciting 20-plus-year-olds, were suddenly being invited by their major study teachers, for example, who'd been complaining they spent too much time online, to show them how to do it. And that was a very interesting sort of and fascinating dimension. In some ways, it's facilitated our desire for some transition. I think there's been an interesting shift inside the education sector, which has not fully yet been embraced even by the education sector itself, but probably also not by the industry. The last 20 years, roughly, we've been told more and more about a sort of mythical program whereby you come in, you get told what learning outcomes you need in order to fit into established systems. And of course, that might work very well in those institutionalized areas like law or medicine or engineering or something. It's already been a little bit dubious in relation to music, classical music, which has got its institutions, but it's also got its challenges within the institutions. Um, we've been invited more and more to talk to the profession and obviously get our students ready for those professions. And for those professions, it's very important that the students are, for the institutional dimensions of the profession, it's very important to have those linkages. The challenge has been, however, that for many of the students, that's not the direction they're traveling. And what we're finding more and more is as they get taken away from, I mean, there's more and more pressure on them basically not to do the arts. We've seen this, for example, recently in Australia, now wanting to try and do positive thing, sort of positively discriminating against artists by charging them even more at the entry point. So the people I'm seeing coming through in their early 20s are really out to get the arts into the community, and they're looking for new platforms and so on. And so they're actually becoming much more interested in the concepts of artistic identity and forming their own networks and so on. These are all things which happen through COVID because as you go online, you need to work together. So as we were working with the professions, it occurred to me the other day that the risk has been that if we were in 1780, we would have been asked to spend more time listening to the Archbishop of Salzburg than to Mozart. And I think artists in their early 20s are showing us in COVID a lot of new ways of working, which our curriculums are not ready to prepare them for, because we tend to try to tell them how to fit and to fit in rather than to listen to how things might change. And so a lot of stuff that I've seen online is obviously by definition less formatted, less fixed, less ready. But we see in the students themselves a desire to play more with their own voice, to create, to arrange, to collaborate, even within classical music, to play with repertoire, to produce it differently. And so there's a whole pile of things that we're now beginning to see as they come onto the new platforms. An example I saw was a master's student who suddenly decided to put her piano recital on Instagram. Instagram's platform only allowed her an hour to present, and some technology things meant that she lost the last movement of the Schubert B-flat major sonata, which she had to replay. In replaying it, which she only discovered after she'd completed the full work, in the rondo form, she suddenly found herself turning to the audience spontaneously and saying, "You can't possibly want to hear this again." Now, it's not something that would happen in the Wigmore Hall, but it actually is a moment of informal alternative platform presentation. It was fascinating, and it's just a moment. What we're seeing is the students have therefore had to work more informally. They've had to use us more as a resource center. They've been working with others network opportunities. They're finding reflective space as mirrors on themselves, incubators. It's like an experimental laboratory, and they're loving it in some ways. And I must say, in terms of even outcomes, the quality of traditional performance through them taking on more of their own learning has gone up. So there's a funny thing where the physical lockdown basically has enabled a sort of conceptual freeing up. And when you're looking at young Asian students suddenly able to express themselves, it's been fascinating. One young Singaporean female student who'd been before working with Syrian refugees in classical music, but in Indonesia of all places, suddenly able to find ways to frame that online, and yet it's a classical singer basically, no longer feeling that the music is owned by somewhere else in the world, but increasingly by her herself, and seeing the world as basically freed up. I've seen projects where students have gone outdoors because they can use the microphones differently. They're not suddenly in the space as before. They're playing with persona, so they're not just trying to be themselves, but also trying to be others. Conversational playlists where they begin to think about how you engage with the community to be more broadly engaged. Daring to make music beyond their expertise, so pianists that will be doing a little bit of singing around their work. taking on politics, as in Singapore, where artists were just judged the least necessary profession in the community. They found ways of bouncing back on that one with humor and satire. They're not able always to express some of these shifts, and that's always been the challenge. The power boundary leaves them separated. But my take on this now is what I've been asking faculty to do for the last few years, and what they're now, in this last couple of months, begun to do, which is to listen and to facilitate. And the change in that power relation, I think power relationship has actually been really healthy for everybody involved. So we're going to see, it's a very disruptive time. There's a lot of just-in-time reactions. But there's stuff to take away from it, where the future will be different, but the future will be live. We've seen obviously also what's been lost by not being able to connect. The future will be collaborative and more connected with each other than ever before. They're probably not going to write essays, and they're not going to do a monologue like this one full of jargon. Sorry, I apologize, but it tends to happen when we start talking. The answer is, I think instead we need to listen to them. Listen to what they're doing. See what of the best of it brings music alive, makes the music connect, and then facilitate that. The majority of people are not great artists, they're good artists. And they've got things to contribute to community, and they need to be valued and heard alongside the great artists. Good artists recognize the beauty and capacity of the great artists. Now it's about enabling the diversity to speak, and the diversity is about crossing genre boundaries, it's about crossing geographic boundaries, gender boundaries. There's a lot of age boundaries, perhaps, above all. Classical music is not an old person's sport, and some of the young people coming through are having more opportunity to express it to other young people, perhaps, than ever before. So sorry, Ben, I didn't give you a chance to interrupt, but you can now.
It's quite okay. It was fantastic, and it was exactly what I was, some of the, I relate many of the topics you brought up we're going to pick up in various ways through the rest of the panel. And power shift and relationship resetting is definitely current. I would like to invite Mr. Parrott to take the floor, take the microphone now to share your thoughts representing artists and future ways that performances may go and future opportunities for artists of the future. Mr. Parrott, thank you.
Hello, welcome to everybody. In thinking about what I could say usefully and having contributed to a few webinars recently, I think first of all, I would just like to put a little bit of context to how I see the thing at the moment, the situation at the moment globally. And I have to say, I think that we delude ourselves if we think that somehow there is any possibility that we will return to anything near what we have remembered so recently. Because quite apart from the enormous impact that COVID-19 will continue to have in all areas of our activities, there are also other enormous problems which are just waiting to play out. One of them, of course, is climate change. Another is the massive degree of unemployment, which is almost certain to hit us, all societies, from probably the later part of this year. There will be, in my view, an enormous increase in mass migration and issues to do with that. That in turn, I think, will reveal and emphasize the still grotesque inequalities in most major societies around the world, and will further exacerbate the disastrous situation of the least privileged societies. I think that there will be huge outpourings of social anger and frustration. There will be major problems of mental health. And there will be, I think, a great and dangerous growth in political extremism, right and left. And there will be, I think, setbacks as well as some advances in the crucial area of inclusion, opportunity for equal access, and indeed an understanding on the part of the powers in our lives for the value of creative activity as a whole. So, to me, one of the most extraordinary things about this experience of the last few months is that, and this has been touched upon already, is that the independent creative artists, whether they are musicians or dancers or painters or actors, have been to a very large degree left to sink or swim by the big established institutions and governments. And this seems to me to be so fundamentally counterintuitive when you think that actually nothing that we do, nothing that we support has any meaning or value unless the creative artists are at the heart of it. Without the creative artists, orchestras will have a very short life in the future, and the same applies to every other creative art form that I can think of. And yet, in many, many discussions I've had with a lot of different institutions around the world, I won't say the majority because there have been some extraordinary exceptions, but I would say that I have encountered, to my dismay, a very substantial number of people of the best intentions who have basically thought that the preservation of the institution is the ultimate priority, partly, of course, for the legal reasons that in most cases, the people who are employed by the institutions or the people who have long-term contracts or are supported, protected by unions or whatever, they, in fact, are much more difficult to neglect. I find it extraordinary that there has not been a much wider consensual view also amongst the funders, the patrons, the supporters of music and arts institutions. I include, of course, teaching establishments. I found it extraordinary that there has not been a wider consensus that there needed to be some form of emergency funding which would actually support the creative process through the next years of certain difficulties. But I think it's a much bigger and more serious problem, because I think it relates to actually what sort of society we want to live in, what sort of society we want to protect. And again, I find it extraordinary that artists, creative people, who are the best people to be able to share those life-giving experiences, the enhancement of everything that makes one a human being, are somehow, their voice is somehow hidden, suppressed, certainly not heard, with the consequence that decisions are being made around the world, particularly by governments, with minimal participation by the creative artists and very little attention to what their life experience has been. And this means that I think the whole network of support and understanding of why art is important, why creative is important, is misunderstood, neglected, and devalued. And this, I think, is one of the most dangerous consequences of what is happening everywhere around the world in varying degrees. I've used on a couple of occasions as a metaphor. There's a wonderful book by a German forester called Peter Wohlleben, who wrote a book which was very successful called The Hidden Life of Trees, in which it is clear that the woods and forests which oxygenate our world are connected and communicate amongst each other with a vast interlocking network of roots and fungi and other organisms, which essentially feed into the superstructure above and create the healthy environment in which nature can actually thrive. And it seems to me that this is the most serious problem that we'll all be facing, which is that there is a lack of understanding, a lack of empathy for, and a lack of the long-term danger that we are faced, because the creative area of our lives will be neglected, will be under-supported, and in fact will not be properly financed. And this, I think, is the concern that I have most acutely at the moment, because when it comes to the next round of budgets around the world, facing all of the economic consequences of COVID-19 and the other things I've alluded to, there will be a tendency for politicians to reallocate the funding available. And a lot of that funding is not going to go to what is perceived by them to be minority activities. Now, if we think for a moment about the extraordinary project which was started, I suppose it's 30 years ago, in Venezuela, the Sistema, it seems to me a great tragedy that this incredibly enlightened idea about how the whole of society is enriched by the capability of bringing to people who, wherever they are, whatever their background is, whatever their lifestyle is, to bring them into the creative experience, to enrich their own estimations of themselves, that this great and grand project should unfortunately have been taken place in a society which in a sense was not worthy of it. I don't mean the people, but of the government and all the infrastructure. But what it seems to me is that, and the artists are the people who have to be at the heart of this, is that we sort of need a worldwide engagement with a new Sistema, which puts the creativity of people, and the people who are best able to foster that are indeed the artists who have already engaged with this as their life and their future. That what we need is a system of measures which will actually create a sort of worldwide Sistema for the creative arts. And of course, these are general principles, that topics which are not specific to the action that people have to take. And of course, that is also fundamental. The devil is always in the detail. But I have absolutely no doubt at all that there needs to be, in each and every area of our world of the creative arts, there has to be a fundamental rethink of what we do, why we do it, who do we reach, how generous can that expansion of activity be achieved, how do we rethink halls, contracts, understandings of actually trust. This is one of the most, to me, one of the most important things that has been neglected, damaged seriously in terms of the future, is the breakdown of trust between actually those people who provide the opportunities for artists and the artists who actually therefore then create the work. And this is going to lead to an enormous series of problems with regard to how to regulate agreements and understandings. I have been working 55 years in the music business. I've probably signed 50,000 or more contracts, many of them after the event. And it's all been based upon trust and understanding. That has, because of force majeure and other, what I would describe as discriminatory practices, and particularly the neglect of the value of the artist, this has begun to break down. And it will cause everybody working in this field enormous damage when we struggle to find new ways of making it work again. So I come back to it. We must reach out to and find and re-engage the artists. The artists need to be also the spokespeople. They have to be given the platforms to be able to convince with their talent, with their charisma, to convince the interlocking connection, that like the root system underneath the forest, we have to get the artists to be able to make sure that everybody knows how to have access to all of this.
Thank you very much, Mr. Parrott. Thank you for touching on, or expanding actually, pushing the earlier topics that were brought up first, way beyond where we need to go, and it's essential. This is the first in a series of webinars, and this particular webinar is to open up the sort of topics, but we will continue and we will have more performers and more artists on this same platform in future sessions. I'd like to pass the floor now to Professor Wang from Beijing at the China Conservatory of Music, director, president of the conservatory, a composer himself, and president of the Global Music Education League. Professor Wang, please. Thank you.
Benjamin, thank you, and it's a great pleasure to see you again. And at the same time, I would like to thank the Foundation for organizing such a webinar, for gathering everyone together. We have all experienced the COVID-19, but I have seen that people from across the world have the confidence to win this battle against COVID-19. For the development of classical music, and also when we faced with new media and the rise of the internet platforms, how can we further develop music? This is indeed something that we need to discuss and study and deal with many new problems. As a president of a conservatory, I deeply feel that before the COVID-19, not many people feel related to the online courses in education. But after the COVID-19, the teachers cannot meet the students in classes, and the artists cannot meet their audiences in the music halls. They cannot gather together to enjoy the music. Therefore, we have to rely on online platforms like new media to communicate. Such communications enable us, especially for those who had some prejudice on new media in the past, to change their ideas. So we realize that in cultural exchanges, in artistic exchanges, and in the development of classical music, the platforms of new media are playing a more and more important and indispensable role. First, its advantages are it makes our Earth smaller, so that we can have this face-to-face talk. Apart from the jet lag, nothing else can stop us to have this face-to-face conversation. For the music culture exchanges across the world, this is of great significance. Therefore, faced with the rise of new media, whether it's for the perspective of artistic education and also from the perspective of the online performances and concert, we have reached a new peak, a new height. And this is a pro in the face with the new media, when we use the new media. The internet is highly developed in China. We are already, everyone is already using 4G, and even 5G is entering people's lives. And in our daily life, we are already not using like credit cards, but using like mobile payment from WeChat or Alipay to trade in our lives. So against such a background, what is the impact from new media on the development of classical music? As I mentioned, it has enabled us to have this first time face-to-face communication. But it also pushed us to rethink a lot of questions. In China, for like iQIYI or other live streaming platforms, also TikTok and Kuaishou short video platforms, and also Himalaya video and audio platforms. Today, a large number of young people are engaging with conversations with other people through these online platforms to showcase their own lives. In terms of music, they showcase their ordinary life. For example, they can sing a folk song, they perform a rural country music, and it will receive like millions or even tens of millions of hits on the internet. The advantages is that everyone can be part of it, and they can be the spreader or the promoter for the dissemination of their national culture. At the same time, we have faced a problem. A lifelong training to showcase on the stage. Showcase which will ordinary people are capable of on the internet.
I'll just make a moment, if I can, please, Professor Wang. I was not hearing the translator very clearly at the end there, so I'll try again. Please catch up that last section. Professor Wang. No?
Which part now?
I think we have a technical problem at the moment. So I will move. I will continue the discussion, and we'll come back to Professor Wang. We've talked about artists. We've talked about creators, and we've talked about audiences and institutions. And I'd like to pass the floor to Mary Finsterer, because Mary, you're sort of, to me, an epitome of the collaborative musician artist. You're a doctor, you have a doctorate in philosophy, you're a composer, and you've been actually working with online and different size ensemble compositions and works for many, many years, and teaching composition. How are things different for you at the moment? And what do you think will be?
Thanks, Ben.
Where
yeah,
are we going?
it is an interesting question. I actually, talking about, rather than thinking about this as a very different process for a composer, it's actually, we're very used to actually working in self-isolation. We do it all the time, particularly if we work in notation and we have to spend lots of amounts of time experimenting and exploring ideas and then notating. So that process in itself necessitates that we actually be by ourselves a lot. There's been some really positive outcomes, of course, negative ones. A lot of concerts have been cancelled. That means for a composer, myself and many of my colleagues, deadlines have changed, and we've had to actually just rethink because our deadlines, we're always working to deadlines. We're thinking about how we're going to organise our time, and when the performances either are cancelled or they're postponed, how do we actually make effective the time that we actually have now, rather than thinking that there's a hole where there should have been something. So I think that for composers, generally speaking, even though there's been a lot of disappointment in the industry, generally for composers, the ones that I've spoken to, they see this as a great opportunity personally, because the idea of research is something that's very important to them. So many of my colleagues have spent time researching those things in their bucket list that they haven't had a chance to do. And so they're really maximising the potential of this time, so that when we're out of this lockdown, we can actually really go forward with a really positive momentum. So that's a really positive thing that I see coming out of this. And the other aspect that you brought up, Ben, was the idea of working collaboratively and over, I've been doing that actually. It reminds me of the very first time I worked on a film. I was part of a team where there was a film production in LA, and the team process was such that we did have to actually do everything online, because all of the composers were, working from different parts in the world. So that's very much, has been happening for many, many years in the film industry. And also because I think as composers, many of their work happens with different ensembles all around the world. They have to actually rely on technology, which of course is much more sophisticated than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. Now they're very au fait with actually sharing ideas across the internet and across these different platforms. I think that that what Bernard said about the younger generation actually having a really innovative input into that is a really that in itself is a great positive outcome. And I think that really there was another point that I felt like I really just wanted to touch on regarding what Bernard said, and that's this idea of crossing boundaries. And from my point of view, and what I'm seeing of great benefit for student composers, is this idea of going back in time and looking at music that is sometimes deemed to be a little bit not in fashion, but music nonetheless that has wonderful tools for us to explore and wonderful worlds that we can actually meander through and discover these techniques and ways of constructing form and gesture and articulation, and how do we bring that forward? How do we not lose the wonderful resources that have actually enabled us to be where we are now? So I'm really seeing this wonderful, rich reservoir of inquiry happening with composers, and as we also collaborate with our, you know, the performers, as we're working toward an eventual outcome once this lockdown lifts. So I think, yeah, there's been some really positive outcomes there. The other thing that I'd like to say, just what I'm also seeing is the opportunity for composers to actually collaborate together on different projects that they wouldn't have had that time, give it, you know, when there's a lot of deadlines approaching and they've got their schedule already in place. Suddenly there's time to explore and, as I said, look into those ideas that they may not have had a chance to really consider, with no outcome specifically, but thinking toward, well, this is going to be useful for me, this is going to really help me, this is going to actually enrich my my mode of investigation and my methodology going, you know, as I approach, you know, my aesthetics. So and so, you know, on that level, I myself I'm also, I've started a project, for instance, where I'm actually collaborating with a composer, a film composer. I mean, he's very much a film composer and not necessarily working in the concert world. But for me, it's really exciting because it means that we can actually learn from each other in our different worlds and really build something that we're not sure exactly what the outcome is. And that's just the beauty of it, because we're in this existence where we don't really know what the world's going to look like once we come out of it. So I think this project in itself is reflecting the very nature of that. And I think that's where we can actually embrace, move into this realm of really just exploring ideas and not necessarily trying to harness the outcome too quickly and thinking of large scale forms, because normally speaking also we're always thinking of short scale forms or short time frames, because the internet and these various platforms don't really.
Mary, I'll have to pop you on hold for a moment. The picture has stopped. We'll pick that up in a moment. I'd heading next to Oliver Condy. And Oliver, thank you for joining us today on Deadline Day. You're part of another side of this space, this sector, this industry, for those that call it that, that's had to rethink business models. And this year has totally impacted your and people's access.
Enable us to...
Sorry, Mary, I'll just put you. Oliver, how are things in Bristol?
They're actually fine. I'm actually down in Taunton. We could be anywhere doing the magazine, frankly. 20 years ago, it would have been impossible to put together a publication simply because pages had to be laid out by hand, photographs had to go to a reproduction house to be scanned. All the processes were not automated. Now the software and the technology is in place to be able to do a magazine, and I'm very thankful for that. We're all very thankful for that. The thing that I find is we share with the music world is this fact that we miss collaborating with our colleagues. So we can make a magazine like we can make music on our own, but we miss that ability to actually in person discuss our ideas. And I think, although I hope the magazine hasn't suffered, I'm sure that there are things that we would have loved to have developed a little bit more had we been able to be together. And I think that's the same for the music world as well. I think it's worth touching on technology as well, because I think we've been talking a lot about philosophies today, but I think practicalities have to come into it an awful lot. And one of those big practicalities is, in fact, as is being demonstrated today, in fact, is that technology isn't quite up to the ability to make music making a reality. People are spending hours and hours and hours not only performing their parts to send to someone to edit together, but those people are spending days editing together a choral work. There are technologies in place. I think it's being used at the New World Symphony over in Miami and Royal Academy of Music. This sort of idea of Internet 2, this idea of an extreme broadband where music making can be done in real time, where people can collaborate in real time. And I've certainly found that with my daughter, who only has just started playing the piano, learning the piano at 5.5, you know, she can't really have effective lessons over Zoom or Microsoft Teams or FaceTime, because that ability to communicate immediately just isn't there. And I think a lot of people are finding that. I sing in a choir in Bristol. We're missing each other very much. And although we are an amateur choir, non-professional choir, we are of a fairly good standard, but you cannot sing with masks on. Quartets can, pianists can, but obviously woodwind instruments, brass instruments, singers cannot. And of course, with a voice, germs carry further. So this idea of a 2-meter exclusion zone is probably not going to work for singers. These are problems that I think are going to extend well into 2021. And of course, then you have the whole financial problem. You know, how do we make this work? One of the ways I think that can succeed is through the record industry. The reviews that we run in the magazine, we run over 100 reviews in the magazine every month. The releases have not yet diminished. And I think that, you know, people will still be able to record solo guitar, flute, violin, even quartets in imaginative ways. And I know there was one jazz release that a big band jazz release that recorded in individual homes, but I didn't realize that was the case until I'd read the press release. So people are making very inventive use of the technology that is available, because of course on a CD, you're not seeing the performers, you're literally hearing the fruits of their labors. So I think the record industry can be somewhere where there can be small wins, and at least musicians are able to carry on in effect, performing and delivering their art to audiences. But finance is going to be a problem in the UK. Not only do we not have sufficient government resources, but of course there isn't the tradition, there isn't the sense that private donation is going to make up the shortfall either. So ticket sales are crucial to the success of soloists, of ensembles. So all these sort of various practicalities have to be thought through before anything else, I think, is tackled.
I'm really glad you've touched on the ticket sale argument, because of course, the panel today is a representative of different parts of the globe, and every state, in fact, even to use every nation, but even every state, for instance, in Australia, has a different policy response to COVID-19. So rules and regulations are changing constantly. I know that certain borders are closed within Australia, so how do you connect with artists and ensembles? And parts of Europe are opening up for orchestral performances with full houses now, and other orchestras are closed for the rest of this year. So every local policy affects things greatly as well. For this sector.
And of course, all these halls are going to have to make do with local musicians. I say make do, but they're going to have to use local musicians, which can be an advantage and a disadvantage, of course. You know, in the UK, I cannot see us having full audiences in halls for quite many months, well into 2021, and that poses huge problems. You know, I cannot see the practicalities as well of sitting, you know, every other row and 3 seats apart. You know, part of the concert experience, of course, is the shared experience, is the idea of being able to get together and talk about the performance over a drink. You know, these things that are taken away for live performance. Why would you travel to a concert hall to sit alone? Yes, live experience is, you know, the magic of the actual performance itself, but there's so much paraphernalia. If I go back to my office, I don't want to be standing in the queue for a coffee for an hour and not being able to, you know, pick up a magazine or sit 3 desks away from my colleagues. I'd rather stay at home and carry on doing the magazine. And I think the same is going to be for audiences. You know, why would you go to a concert hall for a very much reduced experience for what in fact would be a higher concert ticket price? Because one would have to charge higher concert ticket prices to make up that shortfall. So the complications are huge and the realities are really quite frightening.
There is discussion that governments should make up the shortfall and pay for the non-filled seats due to the virus. But I'm with you, Oliver. I feel very strongly about the experience as a collective and whether it's worth heading down that path. Thank you. I'd like to jump to the US now and to Professor Brubaker. You're a pianist and an educator, and of course an established musician. Are you seeing any of your students at all? When did you last see? Can you see your students? What is the current situation in Boston?
Well, I think like many people, we've been teaching online, and it has drawbacks, but it may also have some benefits. I think in this moment, in our current moment as musicians, we may feel shocked by the problems that we are fearing in going forward. But what I want to say is that the bigger shock, the bigger despair that I have is not about the future. My shock really now, as a result of the events this year, is that I am aware of problems in how we as a society were living and how we were making music just a few months ago. We were complacent. I think now we need to be living music so that it really matters and so that music is useful. We're in an intense period of artistic interaction, technologically enabled interaction. And it shows more clearly than ever that music is a group activity. Music and technology is a long story. The piano is a technology, the violin. When sound recording came along at the end of the 19th century, well, then musical product became physical and eventually transmissible. If you think about the earliest sound recordings, they weren't treated very seriously. Recording was almost like a toy. We have those 2 very short cylinder recordings of Brahms playing the piano. And that somehow reminds me of the sonically flawed webcasts of the last few weeks. Timo Andrus or Igor Levit in his living room. It's the beginning of something. The internet has given us the music of all time, all of the time. It's on our devices, it's in our pockets. And I think that truly the word music has come to mean sound recordings of music. That is the global experience, that constant, unstoppable listening to recorded sound. You were talking about education, and of course, classical musicians start as children. And was it really your choice when you were 3 years old? But now, I think before it's too late, we have to answer what motivates us to play. Not just because it's something we've always been doing, but for some other reason that we need to be able to enunciate. Why do we play Beethoven? I have to say that fairly often my middle-aged friends, pianists, have come to me with a radical, great new idea. They say, I've decided I'm going to record all of Beethoven's piano sonatas. And I'm afraid that I have to compare that to a wealthy person who decides to climb Mount Everest. You know, it might be a wonderful, personally fulfilling life experience. Of course, you can also die up there. But is anything really added to our collective knowledge? Is that a really useful, expensive trek to make? And in truth, I would answer that it's a fancy hobby. If we're experts in music, we need to know about now. If you think about a scientist who might say, well, I only repeat the experiments of the 19th century. I've worked on them and I can get some fantastic results in the laboratory. But would we consider that to be science? I would say that that scientist is really perhaps a historian, but some people may even say that classical music is a museum. But even in that domain, I think that useful museums undergo renovation and undergo remodeling. A lot of classical music itself is authorial. Some people might even say that it's authoritarian. It's a top-down organization. The composer is fully in charge, giving us beginnings and endings, lives and deaths. And it reflects an old power structure. God told the king told everybody else, men told women, adults told children, or beat them up. Can I retain those artifacts? Can I retain the symphonies, but reject their social underpinnings? I think in our businesses and sometimes in our government, we have tried to move towards more balanced participatory structures. And then I would hope and I believe that there is a further generational shift. I would have to say one of my piano students turned out to be a very gifted conductor after just a very short period of study. And I heard him conduct a really good performance of Schubert's Fifth Symphony with one of the Harvard orchestras after he had become their principal conductor. And I said to this guy, you could really be a conductor. But he said, I don't want to be a conductor because I don't like telling other people what to do. You know, in classical music education, we still hear that it's a meritocracy. A lot of my colleagues will say, we only accept into our school the very best students. But is that some viewpoint that we can really accept at this point? How do we assess talent? How can we be sure that when we respond, when we love the playing of a prospective student, that some of that reaction is not, oh, that's just like me. You know, in the last year at Yamaha, I was involved with a project that was called Dear Glenn. And our intention is to make an AI, an artificial intelligence, that will play any piece that we give it in the style of Glenn Gould. And I'm not sure that this thing succeeds. But we did learn so much from this project. We learned about micro-timings, beginnings of understanding micro-timings, those little variances of rhythm and beat that human beings bring to every performance that they ever do. Certainly, technology is going to be part of the answer in making music. And I think that the relationship between humans and our technologies is going to evolve even much quicker than we can imagine. Think about how it's impacted something like the practice of medicine. There's still going to be something for humans to do, of course. And I've thought about the auditions that happen at my school every year. And you could say that in those auditions, we are evaluating piano playing, and we are evaluating piano playing. But you could also say that we're evaluating music making that uses a piano, and that's true. And I've even carried it further now in some kind of speculation in I guess it's a thought experiment. What if some aliens came and vaporized all the pianos on Earth? No more pianos. Some of my students would carry on making music with other means. What if the aliens went even further and they got rid of music? Well, I think we're artists, and some of us would continue making art. It would be a different art, surely. But I would even go further. What if art is gone? What if art itself is gone? What if the aliens got that? Well, some art, a lot of the art that we care about in classical music is, I would suggest, communication. And I think that we will go on communicating and finding a means to communicate, finding a way to speak and to feel, to shout and to be heard. I believe that we will.
I could listen to this for hours. This is fantastic. Thank you, Professor Brubaker. You touched on assessment and auditions and how do we educate and how do we position artists within context. My background is with classical music competitions, so I'm very familiar with ways of assessing and judging, and I'm hoping that with this time, all of that can be reviewed, or certain assumptions can be reviewed in that sector as well.
Absolutely. I think that we're seeing some interesting trends.
Yes.
I know that in China, in some schools now, auditions for admission to conservatories are taking place behind a screen, which of course has been pretty common in the orchestra world in auditions for many years now. And it's made some kind of a difference. But I think that many of us believe that we have to do more than just sit in the audition room and wait. I think we also have to involve ourselves in a much broader kind of reaching out, and probably
Absolutely.
to younger students and to students in disadvantaged communities and people without very much access. And there are some signs of hope. I think there are some projects in that regard, but they're still very small and they need to be much, much enhanced.
Thank you. I'd like to move to recordings. You touched, Professor Brubaker, on sound and recordings, and is music now thought of as the recordings rather than the performance? Business models have changed, and I would like to pass to Till Jančikovič from Idagio, because Till, I'm very fascinated by your new direction during this experience, not only for sharing the music, but also for supporting directly the artists themselves. I pass you the microphone.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to listen to everybody, and I would like to elaborate on 3 points. First of all, I highly respected and listened to what Jasper said, because the question of relevance, what we do, and the larger context of what we do, I think is probably being challenged these times like never before. And I don't want to enter into details, but just to raise some buzzwords, because what is classical music? We can, of course, look at it as an art form. We can look at it as a global entertainment niche. We can look at it as commercial media content. We can, as Jasper said, look at it as a tool that we can apply as a kind of transformative power, especially with regard to emerging communities, started in the 18th, 19th century, going to Il Sistema, and as the music genre of the emerging communities across the globe. We can also look at the community and civic aspect and the kind of social glue that music represents. So just to give an array of possibilities. So this is the first thing I just wanted to raise. The second point is, what is a platform? And number 3, I would like, Benjamin, thanks for mentioning that, to tell you a little bit what we have been doing at Idagio and will continue to do in order also to be practical. So maybe just one word about platform. I personally, coming from music management for more than 20 years, being a manager and a producer, there was a certain moment where I realized that in classical music, we are at the very end, we are competing for the time and the attention of our potential listeners. And this competition is in an entertainment niche, and we are competing with Netflix, with the zone, with the internet. So we are competing with technology companies. And that was for me a reason in 2015 to ask the question, how can we use technology to sustain and maybe even boost classical music? And I think the platform model is a very, very, very interesting one. We all believe it's coming from the Silicon Valley, but at the very end it's simple. And there is a very beautiful sentence by German sculptor Ernst Barlach, who once said, the arts rely on two stakeholders, one who does it and one who needs it. And I think this is a perfect description, and we heard it before, what may happen if aliens would remove instruments from us. I think humanity will always continue to make music. It's really about the artist and the listener. So this is a platform model, and if you look at other platforms, what is Airbnb, what is Uber? It's nothing else than a technological platform that is connecting supply and demand in a totally new way that has been shaking, destroying, and building new markets. And this is something I always thought, well, if we succeeded using this for classical music, that is a kind of the vision we have, it would be to our all advantage. And concretely, what is it that makes platforms so interesting? It's the network effect. And the network effect is nothing else than the more supply you have, the more interested you are as a consumer. And the more consumers you have on the other side of the platform, the more interesting it is for the suppliers. This is, at the very end, in a very simplified way, how Facebook, eBay, and all the other platforms we do know have been growing. And the idea was always, wow, if we could build something for classical music, that would be great, because it would aggregate communities, a global affinity community on one platform. And this is how we started. This is how we started in 2015. And then the first step for us was to say, okay, let's build an audio streaming service. Why? Because the future of listening in 2014-15 was streaming. The usual streaming services don't cater for classical music because of metadata. They cater for pop. 95%, 98% of the music on the streaming platforms is pop. And you have three criteria: the artist, the album, and the song. That's it. In classical music, we have the composer, we have his work, we have the conductor, an orchestra, soloist, singers, and so on. And I personally saw my clients disappearing and becoming invisible on these platforms. So that's how we have started. And we have built a streaming service for classical music. Let's say Spotify, on Apple Music for classical music. We have been growing to 2 million downloads after 5 years worldwide, customers in 190 countries. But that was never the goal. It was the beginning. And when the crisis started, we asked ourselves the question, and it's the only valid question we all have to ask these days, because they are the weakest part in the chain. How can we help artists to earn money online? And there are all kinds of theses about we will have a hybrid model once the shutdown is over. There will be a new world, probably a combination of real world concerts and online events. So we have been doing something very simple. We have been launching very quick and dirty, but you have to be fast these days. And we are now working on optimizing this, a global concert hall, which is nothing else than an online venue that everybody in the world who is sitting in a venue or a hall or a room that has professional audiovisual recording facilities could use to bring his own performances online and to monetize them. And we are testing this with a lot of partners, and we are collaborating there. Some things are being successful, other things are not being successful. But it's a highly interesting field. And maybe one thing I would like to say here at the end, and I would also like to ask everybody to join and to come in and to contact us. I think what we have to do, we have to come up with tailor-made classical music experiences for the medium that's being called internet. Because what we currently see out there are archives. We have audio archives. We have built that as Idagio. We see all the audiovisual platforms. Nice. I can look at a 7 Mahler symphony that has been recorded 3 years ago. There are some legendary recordings. Of course, everybody, I think, in his life should listen once to a Carlos Kleiber recording. but still it's not about the archive, it is about life. And I think the internet is a medium that delivers us new possibilities for engagement, for participation, and just to go out and say, well, there is a concert, a format that's being designed for artists and audiences being in the same room, and we film it because it's already happening, and then we put it online to exploit it, is not enough. And we have to come up with formats. Last description, then I stop. What we started at the Global Concert Hall is to say, okay, everything is live. And we've been testing that with musicians. They say, okay, real time, no patch sessions, no retakes, adrenaline. It's going to be live. It's only there for 24 hours. So it's not a sound recording. It's not an audiovisual production. And after the recording, after the performance, there is a virtual green room where audiences from all over the world can come in, ask questions, and engage with the artist. So this is a very basic setup that we have been starting with on May 28th. And what I have to say, what's interesting, we are in a situation where it was very popular at the beginning of the pandemic to deliver everything for free, which I think is a huge danger and a huge threat to the artistic work, but people are willing to pay. And I think we have to ask ourselves the question, what are the formats, what are the value propositions that are sitting in classical music that people are willing to pay for? To end with a very practical question.
Till, thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin.
I wanted to touch on this because what you're really doing, you're shifting, as you said, recording for archival purposes, and you're talking more to, I'm sorry, there's an echo, and you're now talking more about creating a sellable concert that's desirable in itself. And perhaps to give a bit more explanation to this concert hall situation, the concert is available for 24 hours, correct? For viewing, you buy a ticket and it's available for 24 hours to view as many times as you wish. I think there's something really about that. It's about being ahead of the audience and bringing the audience with us rather than just, archiving moments of classical music. I'd like to pass to Russia now and offer the microphone to Rector Alexei Vasilyev, cellist and rector of the St. Petersburg State Conservatory. We had the opportunity to meet in China last year at a competition, and I'm delighted that you're able to join us and bring a perspective from your country and your experiences with the current pandemic.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for the possibility to join this very actual and interesting discussion. And of course, the problem, this new coronavirus is global, and all of us has, I would say, similar maybe problems, but I am speaking about education because I am a rector of conservatory. And when this lockdown starts in Russia, that was the very end of March, a little bit later than in Europe, and of course more later than in China. We started to think, what should we do now? Because, you know, the classical music education in Russia is very, very traditional, and maybe I can say even orthodox, you know, because we have a lot of old school teachers who are not used to work with computers and online and so on. So I was afraid about the situation and what should we do. But I can tell you about our experience here. For us, this lockdown became very powerful push to develop our skills, I would say professional skills for, that all of us need for tomorrow. And what is good for education institute comparing with artists or music players? We can continue our work, but we have just to change the way. Of course, we lost all the practice, like symphony orchestra concerts and chamber music concerts, and we had to delay our Peak Time by Tchaikovsky premiere. We were preparing that to the date of 180 years of Tchaikovsky. We had it in May, 7th May of this year. So we delayed that for maybe next year. But you know, going online was a new experience for us. We never tried that before because we are, you know, conservative. And that was good. I would say that was good experience for us. And maybe I will be a little bit strange, but I say that we had some good points from the situation too, like international music relationships. Somehow this situation became a trigger to have more international relations. I mean, using the internet, using webinars like today, using possibility of online master classes and so on. So that was good for us. That was new somehow for us. And also we've got a very good audience of foreign students because some of them just never thought before to join our conservatory just because they are far away from here. But now they have a possibility to have some connections anyway. So this is also good. I think a lot of colleagues spoke about our future. I don't know. No one knows what future will wait for us. And I think this is, I think, the biggest problem. We don't know what we will have next month or next year. But what I think about that, that the music, I mean, classical music will become more global. That's anyway. We will be global because if we will need more communicate in online, it's much simpler than fly, you know, to even the United States. It's you like we today. This is I think this is a great example of global communications in classical music. So what can I say now? It's 3 months from the starting of our lockdown. We did the final of our semester, our term. That was completely distant, you know, nothing nothing live. Everything is in internet. And I would say, you know, we did it. We did it. That was not a catastrophic. I am a cellist. Thank you for telling that. So I have not very big, but I have a class of cellists. And I was also practicing with them using internet. And just yesterday they had a last test. And I can tell you, they prepared some works, I mean pieces of music, for that period completely online. That was not bad, not bad. Of course, I understand, and every musician understands that that's not full without a stage performing, of course. That's not full because when you are performing for your phone or for your computer, that's not the same, you know, type of performance you have in a hall with the audience. But what should we do anyway? Now, today, we cannot do that. And we don't know when we can. So I think my opinion, and I think a lot of people in our conservatory think the same way. I think that we need to continue our work anyway. Maybe we have to change some conditions, maybe we have to change some methodics, maybe we have to, anyway, we need to adapt to this situation, because as my colleagues told before, music cannot stop anyway. It will continue. Even if aliens will take the music instruments, or coronavirus will hit us again, doesn't matter. Music will continue, maybe with some new ways of making music, of performing, but it stays. And all of us here in Russia, we are motivated to continue our activity to learn, develop, and practice music. There is no life without music. So this is our, general line, like this.
Thank you very much. It's very helpful to have perspectives from Russia, and I hope lockdown is managed safely and cleanly in the coming months.
Thank you.
Mr. Tarnopolsky, from the Philadelphia Orchestra. Music must continue. Your orchestra is not performing at the moment, but you've established your COVID response as well, your digital platform. How is it running one of the world's major orchestras in this period, and keeping morale and momentum and the business model in place?
On March 12th, we gave a concert in front of an empty concert hall. That concert's archived on our virtual Philadelphia Orchestra platform. We made the decision then really to change from being a classical music producing and presenting organization, classical music and education, really to being a media organization. That concert had an incredible power to it. It was broadcast live on Facebook and on our website. It's garnered in excess of 1 million views since then, probably far in excess at this stage. It showed us that we were wanted and loved and needed, and it really inspired the creation of the virtual Philadelphia Orchestra. It was absolutely essential for us to stay very front and center in front of our audiences in Philadelphia and globally, as President Wang knows from our collaborations with his organization and others. And indeed, it's good to see many familiar faces on this group. Anyway, it was crucial to stay front and center. Unlike Till, who seems to be looking at things from a transactional perspective, from the economic side of it, it is inspiring vision in donors and supporters and subscribers. And that's a very, very important part of the economic model in the United States. So while there's been a fair amount of reliance on government sources, we really rely on and are incredibly grateful for a community of incredibly loyal donors to the Philadelphia Orchestra and many new donors that have come to us since the creation of the virtual Philadelphia Orchestra. What's underpinning everything we do is a set of values and priorities. The priorities begin with taking care of our people. And so, Jasper is correct. The musicians are very, very vulnerable right now. And we are very, very focused on making sure that the musicians and the staff of the Philadelphia Orchestra are in a position without suffering undue economic hardship, which also means physical and psychological hardship. We're very focused on making sure that the organization can thrive on the other side of this. We have a deep responsibility to help shape our society on the other side of it, the other side of this as well, that we need to make sure that the decisions we make today lead to a more just, equitable, environmentally conscious, and I think above all, kinder society. And organizations of education and culture like the Philadelphia Orchestra are going to be fundamental actors as our society is recreated. So Virtual Philadelphia Orchestra has really been the focus the focus of attention. It's been created an outpouring of creativity from within the musicians of the orchestra. Some of our most successful telecasts have been curated chamber music concerts that they have done in this COVID-19 age. We have also been very actively commissioning music, and that's very, very important. The creation of future repertoire, and also aligns deeply with our values. You know, composers are still composing and creating, and there's also been an extraordinary amount of work there. You know, for an example, for everyone, we held an online gala on Saturday night, which just shows what an organization can do and the level of commitment, given the support we've had in response to it, the level of commitment from our community for the Philadelphia Orchestra is helping ensure that this situation organizationally and economically is a slope, not a cliff. The last thing I'll say is that nobody knows what's going to happen next month. All kinds of generalizations are being made, even on this very panel today, that people simply do not know. And the Philadelphia Orchestra is taking a real wait and see approach as to what is possible, what is safe to do. We have a community of musicians here who are eager to get back on the stage in small groups, in a phased way in larger groups. And we are determined to make sure that happens online and in person in a way that is not only safe, but continues to inspire the audiences we've been deeply connected to during this time.
Thank you very much.
I'll put the link to our gala in the chat here. So
please do. Thank you. We have a few moments before we are joined by our guest to make some closing remarks. And I would like to pass back to Professor Wang, who you had a few more points to say before the connection dropped out. So please resume your presentation.
Thank you very much. Due to the internet connection instability, I didn't finish my presentation. So I would like to continue with my view on new media. The new media platform has brought us with many new ways of communication. In terms of the education in conservatories, we use the new media, this platform, to pull the resources from top universities and conservatories from across the world. For example, in some of the fundamental courses, in harmony courses, works analytics, polyphony, and orchestration. In these courses, we can pull the resources and the communication with and from top universities and conservatories from across the world, so that the top resources can be accessed by our teachers and students. To promote global music education, this is a great push. At the same time, we also feel for classical music. I have compared the symphony of the orchestra from Berlin. In playing Beethoven, obviously, the orchestra in Berlin can hit the point more, while in playing Tchaikovsky, well, of course, Moscow is better at it. This is due to cultural differences. In the past, in order to perform a work very well, we need training together with like conductors and everyone to showcase their understanding about the work. Well, today with the internet, the new media, the conductor, the training with the orchestra, and also how these composers understand their own culture, their own national culture. We can reach the result that the orchestra from whether Berlin or Moscow, they can perform very well the works, the pieces from each other, and they can have more precise, more accurate interpretation of the works. Of course, there are pros and cons for the new media platform, the online platform. For example, the teaching of violin and piano. The online teaching have its problems in terms of the sound, the voice. The online platform has its problems, and the videos cannot render the completely precise effect of the voice of the piano. So this is the problem that we face. We have just finished the audition for the undergraduate students. All the students did the audition. They put their, they did the audition live on the internet. But due to technological problems that needs to be further improved, some of the students did not perform very well. But we believe the internet has provided us with many possibilities. We are still exploring the ways of communication among different cultures. It can help us to get together so that in a shorter period of time, we can access to more resources from across the world. This is important. In the end, as a composer, I am also paying attention to how the copyright is protected on the internet. How can we encourage composers to create more works? An important issue is the protection of the copyright. For example, during the COVID-19 pandemic, I have worked together with the president of the Performing Arts of China on a symphony performance. And once it was put in the internet, it reached 200 million of hits on the internet. So for such a huge a number of audience, if we only charge like a small proportion for the royalty, then the income for the composers, for the authors is very low. But today, the regulations and laws for the copyright protection on the internet is still something to be desired. And this is a challenge for the creation faced with the new media platform. We do hope that the webinars and activities like this can pull more resources from across the world, and with the leadership of GFPA, we can pay more attention to this problem and put more efforts into solutions so as to better protect the copyright of the creators, the artists, and give more motivation to the composers and creators. We have many more issues and problems that we would like to discuss on such a platform, but due to the time limit today, I think we can leave many problems, many topics to be discussed in later activities. So here I would like to say thank you to Benjamin again.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. Thank you indeed. I would like to pass to Ambassador Suazo from UNITAR in New York to make a few remarks for us as a group, and I welcome you to the panel today. I invite those panelists that are able to stay a little bit longer to stay on the line after Ambassador Suazo has spoken. So please, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Woodford, for this kind invitation. We are very pleased as a training institute of the United Nations and having a good relation and partnership with the Global Foundation of Performing Arts to follow and to be part of this discussion. In particular, because our sister agency UNESCO and the Convention of 2005 on the protection and promoting of diversity and cultural expression is of the most important for us. We are very pleased to see all the high caliber panelists and the topics that they raised today. All of them are totally and completely valid point, from the concern about the financial problems that may come up after COVID-19, where performing arts or music or paint cannot be considered a priority for governments, and that's a reality. And then I heard at the latest stage some expression, actually was by you, Mr. Benjamin, who said the music must go on. And so that's also a real important point. I also heard about Professor Vasilev. He says about that we can do things through information technology, that we have to be innovative, that we can deliver education, and at the same time we can perform for audiences. The human aspect, and that's where we embrace UNESCO's program on resilient art, because we are human beings and we are resilient. And we have been here and we have been fighting to prevail. And this pandemic is one among all ones, and is one among new ones to come. So we cannot have a defeated spirit. For me, it was remarkable to see all those young artists in Italy and Spain when they came out of their balconies to live the spirit of the neighborhoods in order to cope with this pandemic at the human level. So I truly believe that we can survive this crisis, that we may enhance our way of delivering and performing through innovation technology, through education. And I believe this kind of interchange among us, among yourselves, because you are the professionals, may be able to give us a good way to move forward in the future. So I will encourage you to continue to this dialogue, to continue to meet by the time being in this form until the new normality comes on, and then we can really deliver to the audience. During the economic crisis, and New York has seen so many, there was this old saying that says that Wall Street do not meet Main Street. I may say that the performing arts from the music halls and for theaters has met Main Street because the innovation and the spirit of the human has provided the courage to these people, as I said, to go to the street, to the balconies, to perform in order to live the spirit in support of and comfort us in this kind of pandemics. So my deepest congratulations to all of you, to you, Benjamin, for organizing, for moderating this amazing panel. And let's continue to fight for the cause that we believe. And thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you.
It's our pleasure. Thank you very much, Ambassador Suazo. Thank you. We have 10 more minutes, and I wanted to open the floor to any of the panelists that wanted to add points or thoughts or responses that came up during this amazing discussion. Would anyone like to respond to or have reflections that they would like to share before we pass? I'm just reading something very long that's arrived. For me, as I hoped, I've just been so impressed with the human thinking, the consideration of the human being throughout this experience, and the response with our art form to reshape humanity. Because I think Professor Brubaker touched on this, Professor Lansky touched on this. I think things needed to be reset, things needed to be rethought. Mr. Parrott has been thinking about this not only today with his principles, but also through the work of the HP Foundation for addressing climate matters and other aspects of society that need to be changed as well. I personally think it's been an amazing opportunity for rethinking and resetting, and I hope this can continue. Would anyone like to pass the floor? I was going to pass the floor to Mary Finsterer, but it's incredibly late in Melbourne and she is not able to stay with us, so she's retired for the evening. Okay. Yes, she's gone to bed. But Bernard, please.
As you've just Mary's point about the opportunity, and I think Jasper mentioned this as well, the opportunity whereby people have had more space to reflect, and that, and in fact, it also came up, I think, with Bruce, that the concepts of people now, when they come back, are coming back with a stronger sense of reason, a stronger. I watched some of the Wigmore Hall performances, for example, the lunchtime lives that were being generated through the BBC and so on. That everyone walking on stage was walking on stage with really something very powerful to share and say, and those multiplicities of platforms, I think, are going to be a vital part of the future. Just as another example, I had no choice but to watch a funeral live, but it was very powerful to see that the multiple platforms could exist at the same time. And I think that's something else we can take forward from this, building out, for example, from Matthias's point before, that actually being present in the live, in that, attached to that community as an extension of that community is going to be really critical.
Mr. Parrott.
I would just like to come back slightly to the point about the fact that everything is going to change. We all have to review how we do things, what we are going to do things for, how we will survive indeed, where our values will become evident. And I think perhaps, as we've seen also with the terrible and turbulent events in public life, especially with Black Lives Matter, etc., I think we have to take the, Greta Thunberg was yesterday made a very important speech, I think. And indeed, actually, I'm not at all a religious person, but the Pope's message. This is the biggest opportunity for a reset of values and society that has been thrust upon us. We didn't ask for it. And one of the crucial elements is the opening up of access to underprivileged people who have never had an opportunity to enrich their lives through music and the arts. And this is the most powerful contribution that we can make, which is to change the way we think about our values and what we do and why we do it. And if we don't do that now, there will be no new normalcy. There will just be a gradual disintegration of what we used to believe in. And we have to come back to that.
Here. Have you seen change of this magnitude in your time within the classical music sector?
Are you asking me? Well,
Yes.
No, of course there has been, I mean, there has been a gradual and enormous expansion of those people who participate in one way or another. And of course, the teaching institutions and the conservatories and many very enlightened promoting organizations of one kind or another, and indeed families believing in these values for their children, have brought about an absolutely enormous expansion of engagement, but it still only scratches the surface in many parts of the world. And we shouldn't forget the last last time when we emerged from ground zero was, of course, after the war, and the building up of and the rebuilding of some form of shared participation in creative and the arts was one of the great hopes and ideals for that post-war generation. And I think that the damage may not be quite so visible in terms of the ruined cities and societies, but the damage to the fabric and the value and the belief system upon which we engage ourselves will be as much damaged. And that is where the fundamental nature of change has to come. And also the advocacy, the artists, especially, this is the wonderful thing about the newer generation of artists. They have inbuilt leadership. They must be given the chance to lead and to change. And they must be supported in that and not somehow thought to be left to survive as well as they may, and to depend upon somehow selling their art in a many cases of quite degrading and degraded way. This is a collective enterprise which we cannot shrink from, and if we do shrink from it, and if we don't face up to the fact that our halls are not fit for purpose in the longer term, the way that we actually create the support system so that people who are being educated have the potential to access all of those extra possibilities, that we don't open up our privileged opportunities to people who simply have never had a chance to engage with it. If we don't do that, we will not be able to justify the continuity of what we do.
It's been mentioned here that powerful institutions often preserve themselves as a kind of primary goal. And I think we've seen a few signs of governments reaching out in this period to help people, to even go into debt to help people. What do you all think we can do to encourage our institutions in the arts world, in the classical music world, to not be afraid to take some risk here and actually invest in humans?
Please, Professor Lansky.
I think that's a really important point. It builds on Jasper's point that I think what we need to do is listen to young artists coming through, because when we want that reach out, I must say again, with 30 years of being in senior management in music schools, I've never seen a group as the last couple of years who are more keen on the very point that was being made, that they do want that reach, they do understand the technologies. And I think one of the risks we see in institutions is that we still keep thinking we need to tell them what to do. Whereas artists need to have mentorship, but we also we need to hear what they want to do as well as tell. And it's going to be about changing rather than about continuing. Of course, there has to be belief in the tradition and growth from the tradition. As Mary pointed out before, you can learn from reappraising. I've used the break, for example, to learn the violin fantasy of Schubert, a piece I never thought I'd play in my life because I thought it was too impossible. But living in the world of Schubert, who was himself a young man taking on the challenge of a society that didn't appreciate him, has been really enlightening to just recognize how much we need to listen to the equivalent of the Schuberts today. And that the Schubert can be female, and the Schubert can be Asian, and the Schubert can be whoever. I mean, it can be all sorts of different places that have not necessarily been represented on the journey so far. But there's an opportunity for genuine inclusion, building on the Venezuelan example and so on. So thank you, everyone.
On that point, we have reached, we've gone over actually, but I think that's hardly surprising with a full panel of thoughtful and experienced people. to continue with what Bernard Lansky was just saying, I think I relate entirely, and I think the value of building platforms and advocacy and facilitating young artists to be who they need to be is very much part of the philosophy of the Global Foundation for the Performing Arts, and also this Resiliart movement. So I would like to thank each and every one of you, and the ones that have had to run off to other meetings, for taking part in today's webinar and contributing to this discussion. And I've made copious notes that we can use to to forward and to collate, to assist in advocating for the value. I think value is one of the key words that has come out of today, for the value of music and the performing arts. And you're all assisting the continuation of it in various ways, but the value of the artists themselves, I think, has become really, really clear during this discussion. So thank you so much, firstly, for your time, but more importantly, for your ideas and your knowledge. And we'll continue these discussions, and this is exactly what this platform is for. So thank you for coming together, sharing, and we'll continue this series in the coming weeks. So thank you all, stay safe, and that's all from this webinar entitled Classical Music's New World. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you, Ben.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.